Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We are ready to start now. I think there's still a few people joining, but they can join as we're going through. First of all, thanks for joining us today, and welcome to the launch of our 8th annual study investigating the sustainability reporting performance of the FTSE 100. Today marks quite a special day for us at EcoAct. We're not just launching the report investigating the FTSE 100, but at the current moment in Paris, we're launching an investigation to the CAC 40. Later on today at Climate Week in New York, we'll be launching research into the Dow Jones 30. And then on Friday, we're hosting an event in Madrid to launch the IBEX 35. Just to top it all off too, some of you eagle-eyed viewers might notice that this is brought to you by EcoAct. Today, we're launching our brand new brand. So Carbon Clear and EcoAct have officially joined forces under this new brand, EcoAct. So you'll see a new website live and lots of other things coming out from us in the next few months in this new look and format. Today, we're going to be focusing on the FTSE 100. However, we will be touching across the global trends that we've picked up conducting this study. We are also very grateful to have with us today this year's FTSE 100 climate leaders, BT Group. We've got Gabrielle Ginner and Richard Marsh, both from BT. And later on, they'll be talking us through their leading approach, their leading and winning approach, talking about BT strategy and those business drivers. We've also got Stuart Lemon from EcoAct. Stuart will be talking us through the findings, and then myself, Sam Harris. I'll be sort of sharing the methodology behind the research and talking a little bit about the brand. So this is the agenda that we're going to follow today. I'll kick us off by just touching upon this new brand to prepare you for the new look, give you an introduction to the research, talk you through the methodology we use to score the companies, hand over to Stuart, who will give you those insights, and then we'll hand over to BT to talk about their strategy. Finally, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So any questions that you do have, there should be a chat bar to your right. Feel free just to jot some questions down in there. If we don't find time to answer your question at the end, we'll be sure to get in touch with you in the coming days. So for the last year now, EcoAct and Carbon Clear have been working side by side, very successfully so far, but today marks the day where we're now going to coexist as a single brand, and again, a single name, EcoAct. The 4 reports that we launched today really do justice to our new look and feel. The new brand has been dictated by the way in which we operate as a company. We've wanted to have a focus on clarity and accessibility, try and remove any unnecessary detail, and look at those points that need and deserve action. Also in the new brand, we really wanted to reflect about the people who work across EcoAct. The people here are really passionate about sustainability and environmental stewardship, but we understand that needs to be linked to a business driver in order for it to gain traction. So to reflect that in the brand, we've opted for this clean and confident look. Although we are now EcoAct, the Carbon Clear service line has not changed. Indeed, it's expanded with our new global reach. I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who is the Managing Director at EcoAct Northern Europe, and he will tell you a little bit more about our services.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Sam. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, just a very quick run through the EcoAct service offering. When we started this research 8 years ago, what we were really interested in was pulling out examples of best practice, particularly for those organizations that were on the journey that we often talk about when it comes to climate and sustainability. And really that journey sort of starts with setting a level of ambition, setting a strategy, getting some numbers, setting some targets, and then achieving impact and improvement all the way through. And you know, really what we've got as an organization and now as an international organization is a set of services that reflects that journey and supports organizations all along the way. I don't propose to go through everything on the slide, but really it's about understanding strategic focus, looking at competitors, peers, stakeholders, what's actually physically happening to the climate, potentially looking at scenario analysis, which we're going to talk quite a bit about today, and using those insights to understand how your organization needs to respond to the challenges posed by climate change and broader sustainability issues. That then typically leads into strategy, which can involve science-based target setting, and science-based targets, again, we'll talk a lot about those today, have become the default method for setting a target. But it's also around, communicating that strategy, building that into your risk processes, moving the organization forward in an informed way. All of that good strategic stuff, though, only really works if you've got good data. So a lot of our work, a lot of our services hinge on data collection systems, reporting processes, good quality carbon accounting, everybody's favorite subject, but really driving high quality in numbers so that you can set targets that can be relied on, so that you can drive improvements that really have an impact and really can be believed. That's really where we then get into reduction of impact. There are all sorts of ways of doing this. Some of it's about energy management, some of it's about renewables policy, some of it's about engagement with the supply chain. It might be involved carbon pricing, but these are all areas where we're helping clients now to achieve their strategic goals. On that journey, once you've achieved a good strategy, good set of measurement and targets, you're driving your impact down to the point where you can't drive it any further. That's really where we start engaging on carbon neutrality, looking at how to take organizations into a carbon neutral situation, and in some cases a carbon or climate positive situation. Final piece of the jigsaw that a lot of organizations still perhaps don't get to, and where we help quite a lot, is in that sort of change management, getting the value out of all that good hard work and that good investment, telling the story of what's happening, the improvements that are happening, and where the organization's going forward. So the purpose of the research today is around identifying best practice areas in all of those subjects, celebrating those and drawing them out and providing them as examples for everyone. So at that point, I'll hand back to Sam, and he's just going to talk through a little bit about the research and the methodology itself.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart. Before we get going, for those of you who are new to the research, I just wanted to touch upon the methodology. So this, as I mentioned, is the 8th time we've conducted the report for the FTSE 100. It's the 3rd for the IBEX, the 2nd for the CAC, and the very 1st for the Dow. In total, this equals 205 companies scored, and those 205 companies are from a very diverse range of sectors and operate in very different areas around the world. All 205 companies are scored against the same 79 criteria. These criteria are spread across 4 different research areas. That's measurement and reporting, strategy and governance, targets and reduction, and engagement and innovation. There's also this section called best practice. And now best practice points don't go to a company's overall score. Rather, it's a way for us to identify those companies that are not necessarily in the top 20, but have performed especially well in certain areas. For example, a company might score a point for setting a Scope 3 target, engagement with their supply chain, and showing a reduction in that target. In that instance, they might be awarded a best practice point. The methodology that we use for this has also been developed over the 8 years that we're doing it. Each year, the sustainability landscape changes, and what is classed as best practice also shifts around. So as such, we do adjust the methodology based on that. The research is very independent. So what we do is, towards the beginning of the year, we will ask companies listed in all the different indices to supply us with any links to sustainability content online. Could it be microsites, sustainability reports, annual reports, and the likes? An important part is that we don't actually use companies' CDP response unless it's directly linked to within their content. That's a quick overview of the methodology. If you have any questions about it, you will find at the back of the FTSE 100 report and all reports, there's a couple of pages going into a little bit more detail about the methodology. I'm actually now going to hand back over to Stuart, who will help you and talk you through the different trends from across the globe.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Sam. Yeah, a couple of slides on some key observations drawn across the research into the 4 indices, and then we're going to get on to the results specifically around the FTSE 100. So an interesting observation really coming around renewable energy. There's been a relatively slow adoption of renewable energy over the 8 years that we've been doing the research. And when we talk about renewable energy, we talk both about companies demonstrating on-site generation of renewable energy, and we also include those who are purchasing renewable energy, typically only where we can find evidence that they're purchasing something that's verifiable as renewable. We have seen one of the sort of big macro trends following the Paris Agreement in December 2015. Organizations, corporates in particular, now are taking the achievement of their targets and their driving down of their emissions much more seriously, and it's a larger cohort of organizations that are doing that. So you can see over the last couple of years from the little dials there that the use of renewables has gone up to 77% of the 205 companies across those 4 indices, which is a pretty strong showing, and it's quite a step forward on where it was certainly in 2016, but also 15 and 14 it was a lot lower than that. Another area that we're seeing a significant trend and a significant upward trend is in the use of recognized reporting frameworks for driving the content and structure of reporting. When we talk about reporting frameworks, we're thinking of things like the GRI, UN Global Compact, and 1 or 2 others. Those are typically the largest ones. And what we can see from the results is that there's a very high level of uptake of those across all of the indices, and particularly in the CAC and IBEX. CAC index driven particularly by very strong legislation in France. The IBEX very interesting in that it's a relatively small cohort of organizations that look to each other and benchmark quite proactively against each other. So they typically will each adopt best practice, and if a small number start doing something, i.e. GRI reporting, it's fairly typical that a number of the others will then follow along from that. Another sort of big trend, macro trend in climate and sustainability world, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. We'll stick with calling it TCFD from here on in, for the sake of finishing on time, but the results of that, the report from the task force, was issued in June last year, and it's been very rapidly adopted throughout the sort of large corporate world, particularly in certain sectors, particularly in finance sectors, particularly in electricity, gas and oil supply sectors. In fact, that sector has 100% of the constituents either mentioning TCFD in their report or already aligning to TCFD. And it's interesting that we've seen such a adoption so quickly, because bear in mind, the final results of the report only came out in June last year, and we're only collecting data on annual reports in June, July this year. So effectively less than 12 months to act. So for instance, the FTSE, for 40% of them to already be aligning or mentioning TCFD is quite a step forward. And we're seeing that that's driving an awful lot of corporate behavior and strategic thinking around risk assessment, climate scenario analysis, etc., etc. Final one in terms of the sort of macro observations, the adoption of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, has really taken off, and it's been welcomed by organizations in a very positive way. You can see the results there for 2017. And if we now look at 2018, there's a really large increase. The majority of organizations in all indices are adopting the SDGs. And again, given that they were only launched in January 2016, and we're collecting information from organizations that was reported earlier this year and therefore mostly on activity in 2017, that's a very impressive uptake. And it seems to be a reflection of the fact that organizations want to do something positive. It's not just about complying with legislation. It's not just about driving down emissions. It's also about having a positive impact from sustainable management, sustainable development activity. As Sam rightly said, quite a lot more information in the reports in terms of global insights, and that goes for the rest of the stuff that I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes. So right, on to the results. Drum roll time. We will, in true fashion, do them in reverse order. So we'll start with a blank screen and we'll look at the first part of the top 20. What we always say, and it's very important to reiterate at this stage, the purpose of this research is to celebrate best practice. So we only release the names of those organizations arriving in the top 20, and we consider that all of those organizations are demonstrating best practice. Some are have more thorough and more comprehensive programs and therefore tick all of the boxes in our scoring methodology and score very highly. Others focus in particular areas, but all of these are demonstrating best practice in one way or another. So if we look at the lower end of the table, you can see quite a sort of good range of names and a lot of organizations moving up into the index. A couple of things that we've noted this year in terms of trends: banks are appearing in the top 20 for the first time. And in fact, there are 3 banks in the top 20 this year, and you can see Lloyds there having moved into joint 20th position. We're also seeing a very strong showing from mining companies, BHP and Anglo American, both new entrants into the top 20 this year, with some very good quality, comprehensive evidence of their sustainability programs that they've got employed and that they're rolling out across their organizations. If we look at then the top bit of the table, again, we see HSBC dropping straight into the 4th position there. Very, very good, strong showing from them as a new entrant. And RBS landing in at 8, also equally a very, very good, strong showing from them. And Sky also new to the top 20, having gone straight in at the number 9 slot. So some really good evidence of movement and activity, and it's quite useful and good validation for us that as we change our criteria and stretch our criteria each year, we don't just get exactly the same organizations forming the top 20. So the top 3, if I press the button in the right direction so that we can see it, the top 3 this year are BT, Marks & Spencer and Unilever. That's actually the same top 3 as in previous years. Kingfisher was joint 3rd last year. Marks & Spencer and BT Group have swapped the top spot in a very collegiate way. They like to swap their leadership at the table every couple of years. So excellent result from both organisations, and delighted that we've got Gabrielle and Richard from BT to talk us through their case study in a little while. Okay, so if we could then move on to the global leaders, and what we've done is, because our analysis work is exactly the same for each of the indices, we examine exactly the same questionnaire. We're able to provide insight right across all of the global indices. So we've compiled a global top 10. And as you can see, it's represented by constituents from each of those markets, all very, very much demonstrating best practice. And HSBC, as we said, new constituent this year, now number 4, puts them in number 10 overall of the global leader table. Again, I'll press the button in the right direction so we can see it. The next tranche of the table shows a very strong showing from the Spanish index. Some very good work gone on in those organizations, particularly well advanced in setting science-based targets, adoption of the TCFD recommendations. They report very well because they're all following GRI standard style reporting, and it means that their performance is very strong. And if we look then at the top 3, interesting that the first entrance in the top 10 and the only one from the Dow is from Microsoft, who are our global leader this year by a good clear 3 points for a very, very impressive and comprehensive program of sustainability, including carbon neutrality and a whole range of other very, very deep and comprehensive programs. Okay, if we move on a little bit, then we've got some sector analysis for the FTSE. Difficult to imply too much from this. I think the main thing is just to have a look at the spread of results. Certain sectors do particularly well. They have very high average scores. Certain sectors do very well in that they don't have a huge spread of scores. You can see that particularly in those regulated industries: energy, water, utilities, pharmaceuticals, electrical, oil, gas supply, typically scoring well, typically quite tightly grouped as organizations. They're driven by legislation and they're also driven by each other. We typically also see good practice from those that are consumer-facing brands, and also typically those who have complex supply chains. That's particularly evident around some of the IT companies, some of the FMCG and sort of supermarket retail companies. Interesting to note, excellent best practice here. We only ever talk about the top 20. There are still within the FTSE 100 organizations who are doing very, very little. One of those on the graph, the obvious one on the graph, is a bit of a statistical anomaly, so we'll ignore that one. But there are actually 11 companies across all of these sectors who are scoring less than 25% in this, and of those 11 companies, at least 5 of those are easily recognizable household names. So whilst there's a lot of very, very good practice going on, there is still scope for more to happen. If we just look at average scores by index, quite interesting that the inclusion of the Dow has changed this slightly from previous years. What's typically happened in previous years is that FTSE has had the highest score, even though it's got the lowest average, and that we suspect that the lowest average is mostly because of the fact that there are a larger number of constituents, and the lower members of that group in terms of score drag the average down. But this year, with Microsoft, the Dow has leapt into the lead in terms of having the highest score, even though their average score is not quite as high as in France, which, as we said, is driven by legislation. If we look in a little bit more detail then about the FTSE 100 and the trends that we're seeing across the constituents of that index, one of the real standout areas for us this year, and something we've been talking about a lot in the last few years, is around Scope 3, the value chain. Emissions and sustainability practices outside direct operations. And what we found this year is that there's been a continued increase in the Scope 3 emission reporting, 7% up on last year. More than 50% of organisations now disclosing 2 or more GHG protocol categories, and that's typically going beyond the sort of standard ones of business travel and well-to-tank emissions. We think partly driven by stakeholder interest and maturity, and also partly driven by CDP and the scoring within the CDP questionnaire. Very interestingly though, and this is quite a step up from previous years, over a third of the constituents are now incorporating Scope 3 into their own carbon targets, and this is really being driven again by responsibility and maturity, but also by things like science-based targets and the Science-Based Target Initiative. So a real sort of uptick there. And also an increasing recognition, and again, greater than a third of the index, understanding and taking risk into account within the value chain, and mentioning that they are actively looking to protect their value chain from risk. And that's a real step forward in sort of thinking in the last year or two. Understandably, FMCG companies, fast-moving consumer goods companies, which have complex, long supply chains, typically they are the ones with the greatest supplier engagement, potentially because they have the likelihood of the greatest risk. But the graph on the left is a really very impressive step up on what we've seen in previous years. The number of companies that are now able to report and evidence the emission reductions that they are driving in their supply chain is nearly a third of the index, and that's a huge step forward on what we've seen in previous years. So a really impressive and very, very encouraging result. If we look at science-based targets, as I mentioned at the start, it's become a almost de facto way of setting targets for corporate organizations now. If we're talking to our customers about how they're going to set a target, it's very, very unusual that they don't want to go down the science-based route. There may be some reasons why they don't. There may be some reasons why they don't want to get them validated, but most will do that. So we've got 8% of organizations have an SBTI approved target. That's up 2 from last year. But a whole bunch of others have committed to set the target, and that's gone a long way forward from last year. Large numbers of the banks and the financial institutions have committed to and set SBTs. As yet, those are not endorsed and approved by SBTI, because SBTI is currently in the process of finalizing its methodology for calculating particularly the impact of scope 3 value chain emissions from financial organizations, particularly asset classes around investments and debt. So there will be more to come on that. The interesting final point on this slide is just that, and we reflected this last year, organizations that have science-based targets typically show year-on-year emissions reductions. Not able to prove cause and effect from that, but it's generally a good sign of strong governance in organizations that are setting SBTs. They're also able to have an impact on their emissions. If we move on then to renewable energy, as we said before, we're seeing quite an increase in this. Not always clear what the drivers for this are. We think it's a mixture of things. It's partly that the cost of renewables is coming down. There are some very cost-effective ways of buying renewable energy now. The International Renewable Energy Agency's recent report suggests that it will be cheaper to buy renewable from 2020. And in some territories, that is already the case. So quite a big uptick there. Things like RE100 and the emphasis on renewables by CDP and the CDP questionnaire is also driving that. And I think what we're probably going to see in the next couple of years is a continued uptick as organizations start to tackle and try to achieve their science-based targets. Renewables, I think, inevitably will be part of the mix there. Final slide from me before I hand back to Sam. Just really looking at TCFD in the FTSE 100. Interesting that, less than a year on really from the launch of the TCFD recommendations, we've got over 40% of the FTSE 100 referencing or reporting in line with the TCFD recommendations. And we see this as the real driver for corporate action, both on the embedding of risk assessment into risk processes side of things, but also in the forward-looking scenario analysis side of things. Those are two areas that we're very, very busy with and helping lots of organizations with at the moment. That's basically it. The only other thing I was going to mention was just an interesting stat that I pulled out from the report around divestment, which is also sort of related to TCFD to some extent. We've now got 13 of the banks and financial institutions in the FTSE 100 actively divesting from carbon-related stocks, and that's a sort of massive uptick on the previous year. In fact, it's 100% up on the previous year. So a real swing in activity there, and I think that's really driving corporate behaviour. We've also seen a number of organisations looking to divest from companies who don't set science-based targets, who don't have active risk assessments and strategies going forward. Those are my observations. Happy to receive questions. Lots more information and detail in the reports, so please do download those and come back to us with any questions later on. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart. That was great. Like Stuart just mention, if you have any questions, please just make a note of them in the comment box and we will try and get around to answering them at the end. The report is also available to be downloaded on our brand new website, which you can access by going to eco-act.com, or the old Carbon Clear site should also redirect you. Now we're going to hand over to BT. Richard and Gabrielle, I will pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. We're obviously very delighted to be recognised in this way, so thank you very much. What Richard and I are going to do this morning, I'm going to talk first about our environmental sustainability strategy, and then hand over to Richard to talk a bit about what we are doing on reporting. And I think we're just waiting for the slides. Sam, the slides are not moving, I think.
There you go. I think it's working perfectly now. It's very temperamental.
Yeah, okay, no worries, no worries. And again, thank you to everybody for dialing in this morning. So in terms of my first slide, this just really illustrates BT's 25-year climate action journey and shows that it's been a journey of continuous improvement. Our focus has been on carbon and carbon reduction, and that's because BT uses about 1% of the UK's electricity, and also, as we've heard about previously today, about supply chain and looking down our value chain, because when we look at BT's end-to-end carbon impact, our supply chain is by far our biggest impact. And it's an area as well where we've seen real improvement when we've been working with our suppliers. So in terms of our journey, in 1992, we were one of the first companies in the world to set a carbon reduction target. Another highlight, in 2012, we launched the BT Better Future Supplier Forum, which was really an initiative from us to try and improve the environmental sustainability performance of our suppliers and try to get them to think more in terms of the environment. In 2013, we launched what we call our net good target, or some companies call it net positive, which is really to show that our impact on the environment is a positive impact. In 2014, for those of you who have been buying the BT Home Hub, you might have noticed we had a completely new design. And that came from a design checklist and how we had been working with our suppliers. So in the past, the Home Hub used to be a square box in very flashy packaging. And in terms of new thinking, our manufacturers started thinking about how could this be improved in terms of environmental performance, and basically changed the design to be a much flatter design so that it could fit through people's letterboxes. And what that meant was, improvement in both customer satisfaction and in terms of carbon footprint, because by delivering to a letterbox, customers didn't have to go to the post office anymore, and that of course saved carbon. And we also completely redid the packaging of it. In 2015, we set our RE100 ambition to be purchasing 100% renewable energy by 2020 worldwide. And a big one for us was in 2016, when we reached our carbon emissions target that we had set in 2008 to reduce our carbon emissions intensity by 80% compared to a 1996-97 baseline. So because we reached that target 4 years early, after Paris, we started thinking about what should be our next target. So in September 2017, we announced a new science-based target, and that was to reduce the carbon emissions intensity of our operations by 87% by 2030. We also set a new supply chain target to reduce the carbon emissions associated with our supply chain by 29% by 2030. Just to explain a bit about our net positive or net good goal, to help customers reduce carbon emissions by at least 3 times the end-to-end carbon impact of our business by 2020. So if we look at this ratio, in the 3, we look at products and services such as video conferencing or vehicle telematics. We add all those up, and then we compare them to the end-to-end impact of BT's business, which is our own operations, our supply chain, and customers using our products and services. When we launched this target back in 2013, we were at a ratio of about just over 1, and we're now at a ratio of 2.2 to 1. And the revenues associated with this portfolio are now at 5.3 billion, or 22% of BT's revenues. So I just wanted to talk a bit about.
Can you knock it forward a couple of slides? I don't think the slide mover's working here. So
yeah, certainly. Just let me know when you want me to change the slides.
Yeah, so we're on this slide now. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a bit about how we're going to reduce our carbon emissions intensity by 87% by 2030. This will require some radical changes to our business. We need to look at how we convert our fleet of 33,000 vehicles to zero carbon vehicles. We're working with vehicle manufacturers, looking at new designs on EV vehicles, and we're also looking at how we can deploy EV charging infrastructure. We also need to look at how we can change the carbon intensity of our building heating systems. Next slide, please, Sam. Looking at our supply chain, we have found that one of the most effective ways of engaging with a large amount of suppliers is through the CDP. We've been a member of the CDP supply chain program for a number of years now, and we're finding that really effective way to engage and to monitor year-on-year supplier performance. We also have launched a campaign with our renewable electricity supplier, Npower, to try and encourage our suppliers to buy renewable electricity. We're building on the relationships we've developed through the BT Better Future Supplier Forum, and we have now introduced a new sustainability contract clause. So basically, when we are renegotiating contracts, we're asking suppliers to commit to reducing energy consumption and carbon emissions over the term of their contract with BT, and we monitor that regularly. We also have something we call the Game Changing Challenge competition, which is a bit like a Dragon's Den. We invite our suppliers to submit new ideas on environmental sustainability, and then come in and meet a panel of seniors to present their ideas, and then we announce a winner, and BT then works with that supplier to try and realize their idea. Next slide, please, Sam. So just in terms of what's next for BT, obviously we're going to be working on implementing our plans to meet our 2030 goals and working on supply chain. Something that I learned a new word a couple of weeks ago, which came from Women Business, the UN Global Compact, and WRI. They've come up with a term called ambition loops. And that is about how when climate actions by business and governments align, they can drive greater ambition. And I think that's really important. And I think that's the kind of support we have seen from the UK government, which is obviously fantastic and something that we will continue to support. So I'm now going to hand over to Richard to talk a bit about our connection to strategy and about our reporting.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Gabrielle. And if you could just roll it forward a slide, that's great. And just to say, we're of course delighted as well to be back at the number one spot. And I must say that we feel a lot more collegiate from an M&S perspective this year than we did last year when they took the prize. But yeah, just to say we were delighted to have that. And really, I just wanted to tie in on the business side to why this area is important. And I thought, first of all, it's important to do that in the strategy. I think having that connection there to the strategy is really important. At the same time, I recognise, not everyone here in the company regularly would look at the strategy necessarily, but I think it is still a very powerful device for saying, here is where our focus is. Here's guidance at the highest level about what we should be doing and equally what we should not be doing. and also as an important way of influencing behaviours and priorities through the company. And what we have in our strategy is kind of the purpose that sits at the top of that, to use the power of communications to make a better world. And where that really helps us is when we're thinking about sustainable growth and value from a business goal point of view, we're thinking about how do we do that growth in a sustainable and responsible way. We're also thinking about how do we meet the diverse needs of our customers, and what's the role that technology can play in making their lives better in the products and the services we offer. And Gabrielle spoke before about how that was integral to how we were thinking about the home hub design that we did as well. And then equally thinking about how we adopt our operating models over time as well, and to think about the changing landscape. So particularly thinking about the electric vehicles piece, which Gabrielle mentioned as well. It's really key that we think of it in that way. And a thing that we do that really bonds this in at the very highest level is we have a set of CEO scorecards that apply for each of the different parts of the company, and they really lock in a way that ties to remuneration some of the key things that we're looking to do from an environmental and a societal point of view. So again, it's a really important reinforcing mechanism that we've got. If you could just knock it forward a slide. And then looking at some of the more quantified ways that we look at the value that comes from the environmental agenda, and we find articulating it in this way can be quite a persuasive thing, thinking about particular communities like the finance, the commercial, the product teams within the company as well. And what you can see there is just some of the ways that we start to look in a more quantified way about the impact that a good focus around the environment can have for us. And maybe just to lift a couple out. So Gabrielle spoke before about revenues, and you can see actually the focus that we've had on products that can really abate carbon are a material part of the company's overall turnover, so just north of 20%. And what I think is really encouraging is that for as long as we've had that target in place, things like broadband and conferencing are the obvious go-to products that you'd expect to see, really contributing heavily. But actually what we've seen these last few years is other areas, particularly in the sort of machine-to-machine and telematics area, coming through quite strongly and offering us, I think, a lot of potential for the future that we can grow in a very sustainable way there. And then the final area I just wanted to call out on here was the area of risks. So probably like a lot of people on the call, we increasingly see a very strong focus on the environment coming through in bids, but also associated with quite a high pipeline of sales contract value as well, where it's really important that we demonstrate that we take this very seriously, that we've got a strong track record and set of results as well. So actually how we look at that and use that as a priority for change is really important for us as well. Just move it forward. So just to share a few changes that we've made from a reporting perspective, I won't dwell on the targets after Gabrielle spoke to that, but I just wanted to maybe list out a couple of other things. So the first was natural capital assessment. And what this was about was really finding a bridge between some really good work that was done on the natural capital protocol and looking at how that could be useful for us as a business. And what we did just to make it very real was look at some of those principles, look at where it might be possible to quantify natural capital impacts in financial or other terms as well. And then looking very specifically at how could they improve the way that we might look at risk, improve the way that we might look at procurement, and improve the way that we look at product launch as well. And it was really good that when we looked at it in each of those three areas, we could definitely see further things that we could do, either in the form of changes that we could make that would improve the kind of currency and the way that we measure it as part of those decisions, or at the level of saying, actually, there's an investment that we need to make in our staff, really to help them think about these things naturally when they're developing products and doing potentially taking on new partners and suppliers as well. So that was very useful. The other one to call out was just about really trying to up our game in terms of reporting, because I often look at sort of our report, which we do, and there's always a lot there, and it's quite a lengthy document, as you'd expect as well. And what we want to do is just make sure we've got that balance right of really trying to move the needle in terms of the disclosures that are there, but also responding to what are the needs of the people who kind of consume this information. And is there an easier way to do that? And a key thing that we did for the first time this year was produce some content that could be very easily consumed on mobile. And we had really good feedback from people that it allowed them just to get straight in on any device and just to access the thing that they were really interested in. So that's certainly something moving forward we'll look to repeat. Just move it forward, please. Great. I'll carry on talking. My screen, unfortunately, has gone blank, but I'm hoping that's not a universal issue for people. But just finally, I wanted to share what's coming up next for us. So the first bit is about, how do we better systemize the data? So I'm sure anyone who's heavily involved in year end would regard it as a fairly traumatic experience in life. And actually getting hold of data early is a real challenge, actually, because often we're waiting for bills to land on the mat. And what I'm very keen that we do is just really, as much as possible, get fully on top of all the data, systemize and automate as much as that as possible to help us just from a speed point of view, but also from an integrity point of view as well. So that's something we're putting quite a lot of emphasis on at the moment. The next area is thinking about how we keep pace with the new targets that Gabrielle keeps setting us. So very much as we think about that 2030 target, we actually need to be interested in a lot of things like battery performance. We need to be interested in EV charging infrastructure and other things that, under previous regimes and targets we were just not thinking about. So actually how we adapt the reporting to help us know if we're on the right track and the right glide path is a really important thing for us. And then the final one is just on the disclosure point. Again, I think we've ever looking to disclose more and more of the things that are important in a really high quality way. But at the same time, I want that to be really balanced because I'm sure, again, probably a lot of people on the call will feel quite stretched and often pulled in lots of different directions about how to present that information. So I think getting that right balance of disclosing more, making that universally available, and then hopefully having that naturally fed into things. And this Eco Act index is a great example of that, where that information's pulled through and looked at objectively. So brilliant. I'm going to close there. If I could hand back to Sam now.
Guys, thank you very much for that. That was a really great insight. And I noticed a slip there at the end calling us carbon clear. Let you off.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I'll let you off. Just wanted to really say thank you very much for taking part and well done for your top performance. It was great at the end when you were showing all that important quantifiable link between the business value. And also it's nice to hear that you're still grappling with those issues that nearly all organizations would, such as the data collection at year end. So thank you very much and congratulations. We've been given several questions throughout the webinar. I will handle the first one. So someone asked the question, which was, when was the membership of the FTSE 100 finalized? It's an important question. The FTSE 100 changes regularly throughout the year. We took a snapshot in May, I believe. So obviously there's been some companies that have recently entered and some companies that are actually left. If you are one of those companies that have entered the FTSE 100, just drop us a note after, and we're happy to run you through our scoring methodology and rank you. Equally, if you're not a FTSE 100 company but want to know how well you would have done, happy to run you through the scoring methodology too. I'm actually going to hand over to Stuart for the first question. Stuart, someone asked a question, do you have a best practice example for TCFD within our analysis? Is that something you can answer?
I'll give it a go. Yes and no. There are a number of best practice examples throughout the FTSE 100. And in typical consultant style, the answer to the question probably depends on which sector you come from. Rather than trawl through all of the FTSE 100 annual and sustainability reports to find the answer to that, what I would suggest is that there are some quite useful materials and case studies appearing on the tcfd.org website. That includes a number of the FTSE 100 constituents talking about their approaches. What we typically find is that approaches are different by sector. So if you're a financial institution, typically your scenario analysis and your risk assessments will be focused on your asset classes, your investments, your debt, your equity, etc., etc. If you are an infrastructure organization, if you are supplying gas, or if you are a mining organization, typically your scenario analysis and your future planning will be targeting scenarios around the potential physical impacts of climate change on your operations, and clearly the potential impacts of the transition to a low carbon economy on your markets in the future. So typically what we see at the moment is organizations doing bits of that well. And there are some organizations who have got a very clear strategy for approaching that and are articulating that quite well. Probably sort of unfair to call those out on here. There are one or two in the top 20. BHP Billiton is one of those. But I would suggest going to the tcfd.org website and having a look around at the case studies and some of the supporting materials there to find out more. And obviously get in touch with us if you've got specific questions about how you might approach responding to TCFD for a specific business or a specific sector.
Thank you very much. Guys, Gabrielle and Richard, I've got a question for you guys. The question is, when it comes to adding value, have BT quantified how their sustainability has added to brand reputation with consumers in material terms, and how has their values influenced loyalty?
Yeah, look, I've got to say straight off the bat, it's a terrific question, and it's one we regularly grapple with. We can see, some measures where you could look to find an impact. So things like net promoter scores, where we typically tend to ask customers a relatively small set of questions, allows you to profile in a little bit. But I think we're still looking for the answer. To be honest on that, and particularly actually when you look at one of the challenges, it's how do you isolate out the impact of what you may do, for example, from a sustainability perspective, from a number of other things that could influence the relationship, like the service that they just had, the price for the particular product as well. And one of the other challenges, of course, then is that often the impact of this might be a sustained boosted reputation as a business. So I think it's fair to say we definitely haven't cracked the code on that, but we're very much working to say, actually, can we get some decent and reliable indicators that build on things like net promoter that would allow us to do that.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. I'm just going to hand back to Stuart now. We mentioned that 13% of banks are actively divesting from fossil fuels. Can you expand on that at all?
A little. Actually, it's a more impressive statistic than that, in that it's 13 organisations from the banking and financial services sector, which represents about 77% of that sector. We've seen a lot of action here. Partly through good internal governance. These organisations are very clearly driven to create value for their investors, their customers, and they typically do have a reasonably long-term view of risk assessment and potentially risk mitigation. I think the speed of action in these areas is being driven partly by the Paris Agreement, partly also by recommendations from the TCFD, and also by some of the NGO sector. People like Share Action have been very, very active at targeting banks, and a number of banks, people like RBS and Lloyds, are now have clear policies to no longer invest in new coal-fired power stations and projects like that. I think you're also seeing customer pressure, investor pressure. Investors want to put their money somewhere that is ethical, but they also want to put their money somewhere that's going to give them a sustainable return. So you're seeing the likes of Legal & General with their Future Wealth Fund, actively investing in renewables and low carbon technologies, and actively engaging with organizations to encourage them to adopt science-based targets and things like that. So I think no single thing driving that, but definitely a lot of activity going on, and the organizations that are continuing to invest in carbon stocks and continuing to invest in organizations with perhaps poorer sustainability reputations, that's practice that's becoming less and less almost on a monthly basis.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And just 3 more questions, and then we will call it there. If you've asked a question we haven't got to you, we will definitely get back to you in the coming days. BT, Richard and Gabrielle, someone's asked, how are BT encouraging suppliers, especially overseas, to switch to green power? Can you tell us about your approach and timelines, please?
So this is part of a continuing discussion. So when we started the BT Better Future Supplier Forum, we looked at a number of areas where we wanted to encourage our suppliers to be more sustainable, and definitely renewable energy is part of that discussion. So for example, we've seen a company like Huawei put solar panels on the roofs of their factories, and it's just through discussion and education really that we try to encourage our suppliers to switch. And as I mentioned, for UK suppliers, we have this offer with npower.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just one more question on the TCFD, actually. It's obviously, as the research has demonstrated, quite a hot topic. Stuart, I would chuck this one back to you as you answered the first TCFD question. Lucky you. Do you have any views on why the UK are picking up on TCFD more than other indices?
That's a very interesting question. I don't have a fixed view. I think probably it's in part because the FTSE constituents do include a greater number of banking and financial sector institutions who have been very in tune with the TCFD since its inception, both in terms of providing sort of delegates as part of the 30 or so members of the TCFD board, and also tracking the implications of it from a very early stage. So I think that's probably the main thing. I think it's mostly a statistical anomaly, but I think it's possibly also that quite a lot of those organizations have physical assets that are potentially impacted by climate change, and they typically have quite good processes in place for doing long-term planning on physical assets. I'm thinking of people like the mining companies here, who we've seen a number of leap into the top 20 this time around, and they are typically doing a very good job of scenario analysis in terms of climate change, partly because they're good at it and they have processes and systems in place anyway for looking at mineral deposits, land use planning, long-term investment cycles, etc., etc. But I think that's probably the reason.
Thank you very much. And I've just checked the time and it's bang on 11 o'clock. Thank you for all the panelists today, especially congratulations to BT. The slide deck will be available for you guys after the webinar. Give us a couple of days and we will circulate it. It'll be a recording. Also, I encourage you to go and download the report, the FTSE 100 report. It's available on our new website. Download it. Any feedback on the brand, more than happy to hear it, as long as it's good. Also, the Dow Jones 30 report is available on the resources area on the website. The CAC and IBEX report are in their target languages. So if you can read Spanish or French, have a read of that too. If not, at some point over the coming weeks, we will be circulating a summary document highlighting the key findings in that French and Spanish report. Thank you very much for your time today. Congratulations to BT and all of the top 20. If you have any questions, just get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.